Okay, thanks so much for coming back to your seats. Before I introduce our next panel, I just wanted to say if you are posting anything on any type of social media, please use the hashtag ANC22, Assyrian National Conference 2022. So much appreciated, just so we can find each other later and look at the pictures together or the tweets or whatever it may be. But yes, in our next panel, panelists will explore the connections between memory and identity by reflecting on the stories of the Assyrian Genocide survivors and their descendants. They will examine the deep sense of responsibility to preserve the memory of these events and share these stories with the world and future generations. And moderating this panel will be Jamie Bahoura. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Hello again. I spoke with you all a bit earlier, so I'm really happy to be back on stage with my two panelists. To kick us off, I think it's really important that we reflect on that poll question that we had right before lunch to see that 75% of people in the room responded that their family has a genocide story. And I think if we look further into the community, that number grows even larger. And I think that's something that's just, it's so impactful, and it's really just indicative of what our community has faced in individuals and families in the past. Today, we want to explore those connections between memory and identity by reflecting on these genocide stories and examining the impact of genocide on our identity, both personally and as a collective. So I'm joined here by two amazing panelists, Jordan Jonas and Mariam Georgis, who will speak on their own experiences with genocide and ideas around its effect on our identity. So if we can give them a hand, please. We're going to be a little casual. This is my Oprah moment. So welcome, everyone. Awesome. So we'll give a moment for our panelists to introduce themselves.
My name is Jordan Jonas, and my dad is an Assyrian. My mom was not, but let me try to just make it brief. I spent a lot of years living in Russia, among other places, and I lived amongst a pretty unique bunch of people. They were nomadic reindeer herders, like in the indigenous people of Siberia. And so I spent many years living with them out in the wilderness, basically. And that opened some doors for me to get on this TV show called Alone on the History Channel. It's where they take you and drop you off in the wilderness by yourself. You film yourself, and they're basically have a little button, and it's whoever lasts the longest. There's 10 people thrown in different areas, and you just have real basic tools like an axe and a sleeping bag and a pan. Just some real basic tools, and whoever lasts the longest wins. And I was able to last the longest that season, so that was pretty neat. But opened up a lot of opportunities to share about, the resilience that was given to me through my grandparents, and that honestly put my whole experience on Alone into so much perspective that I can say it actually wasn't that hard. Because I was just like, man, I have so much to compare it to. I'm like, so anyway, we'll talk more about it, but that's a brief history of who I am.
Awesome. Thank you, Jordan. Mariam?
Shalom Aleichem. I'm not famous like Jordan. My name is Mariam Georgis. I was born in Iraq. My mom is from Mosul, but she is Western Syriac, Soroyo, and my dad is from Inishk in the north of what's today called Iraq. And I left Iraq in the 90s, so I was about 9 years old. And then I arrived in Canada as a refugee, where I was very grateful to make a safe home on the indigenous territory of the Mississauga, Anishinaabe, and the Haudenosaunee. So that's where I was raised. That's today called Hamilton, Ontario, in Canada. I went on to study, and of course, through my own lived experiences, I wanted to understand more of my family stories. So I ended up in political science, and I have a PhD in political science from the University of Alberta. I'm currently a postdoctoral fellow at the University of Manitoba. where I basically broadly my work is on global indigenous politics, and I study Assyrians in Southwest Asia. And I'm very...
We have two famous people on the panel. Come on. That's true. Awesome. All right. Well, thank you all for your introductions, and thanks everyone for the warm welcomes to our panelists. So I think we'll get started. We've had, I think, a bit of a heavy day today. A lot of conversations around genocide, and seeing Grace was really impactful. I cry every time. It's without fail, I think, the impact it has. But these conversations, they're really vital. So I think it's important. It's ingrained in our identity. It's ingrained in our history. And as hard as they may be, we have to talk about it. So I'm excited that you guys are joining us so that we can explore it more. We'll kick off, I think, with Jordan. You briefly touched upon your family history in your introduction, but please do expand on that. Your history includes some really horrific stories from the Assyrian Genocide, and
my grandma and grandpa were both from the Urmia region in Iran. And they both, my grandma and grandpa went through the genocide themselves. My grandpa was 17 and my grandma was 13. So they were pretty old when they had my dad. So it kind of spread the generation out. But yeah, they have some pretty crazy stories on my dad's side, or my grandpa's side. His father was in a wheelchair, and the Ottomans were coming in and they were burning the whole village, and he told my grandpa, basically, he couldn't run. He was in a wheelchair. They don't know what happened. They couldn't find his sister. So I don't know what happened to my grandpa's sister, but he shoved a money belt under my grandpa's coat and told him to just run and don't look back. And so he ran out and, of course, looked back to see the house in flames or whatever. But then he made it and eventually just ran and got to this refugee camp, was eventually taken in by Jesuits and Jesuit missionaries or something, and then so he was raised by them as an orphan. He did have, the only other surviving relative that I know of his was his brother's son, so his nephew was named Zaya Dashtu, and he became he's the archbishop of the Urmia region in the 50s and the 60s. I've met Assyrians who knew him, which is kind of fun. So my family name would have been Dashtu, but the French chopped that off. But my grandma's side also, she was also in Urmia. They came in and took her dad, and all the men took them off, and she and her 8 children were driven out into the desert. This is my great-grandmother. My grandma was one of them. She was 13, and all of her siblings except one died in the desert. And when the baby finally died, their mom just collapsed and said, "I can't go any further." And my grandma Shalom, they picked her up with her sister Shushan, and they took her, dragged her on, and they actually stumbled upon a British military camp and were saved. And I don't think Shushan, my aunt or whatever, or my great-grandmother ever really recovered, but my grandma did. And it's amazing. Those are the stories in brief. Then they met, grandma and grandpa, in Baghdad, and then they went to France right before World War II and went through that whole event, all that. And so they finally came to America and just loved it because, of course, they were finally safe. But what strikes me the most is how much grandma and grandpa went through. They had 11 kids, one of them my dad, but they were such joyful people, and it spread so much into my aunts and uncles that even all my aunts and uncles we didn't grow up around other Assyrians, but up in North Idaho up there where I grew up, it was just everybody loved, my whole extended family because they were such joyful people. And it's wow, I've always been struck by that. How can one generation removed from the most horrible things you can imagine, these people, they weren't defined by who they were mad at. They weren't defined by how bad, life had been for them. They were just defined by joy and family and sharing. And honestly, I had to kind of dig those stories up, as I'm sure so many people do, because it was, they were it didn't quite define them, which is interesting. And but it's been so enriching for me to know, because I mean we'll get to that more later too. But that's the brief overview, and I'm really thankful for my Assyrian heritage, and yeah.
Yeah. Wow. It's very powerful. It's heart-wrenching, to say the least, the stories of all that they went through, but hearing about, the outcome and how you view your family, it's amazing.
Yeah, it's pretty neat that you can overcome that in a positive manner.
Yeah. I think Dr. Georgis, we got to do official.
Just Mariam's good.
Okay, fine. Mariam, so when we talk about genocides that have targeted Assyrians, a lot of times we're focused on measurable impacts. How many victims, how many people are displaced, how many villages were burned, and homes as well. But we don't have many conversations about the long-term effects and the way that genocide impacts or sometimes even destroys our identity. So I want to talk with you about, in what ways has genocide affected the Assyrian identity?
That's a very good question. I'll start off by saying that for me, genocide has had an immeasurable intergenerational impact on the Assyrian identity. That's not to say that that's not something that you can move past. It's just to say that that's been its impact. I want to start off by a quote from, she's a Michi-Sagig Anishinaabe woman, Leanne Simpson, from Canada. And I just want to see from your faces how much this resonates with you. And that's the only reason I'm starting off with a quote. The primary way my ancestors and I have interacted with the state, so she's talking about Canada, is through dispossession, the removal of Indigenous bodies from Indigenous lands. My disconnection from Indigenous thought, languages, and practices has been orchestrated by dispossession, as had the erasure of Indigenous bodies from the present. This is a dispossession of every meaningful relationship from my life. So think about the fact that we're all sitting here on the stolen Indigenous land, far away from our own ancestral homeland, speaking in English. Think about how some of us in this room only speak Arabic or Farsi or Turkish or any other diaspora language where we ended up. Because our language was stolen from us, and these languages were imposed on us through assimilation policies that were very aggressive and had a very particular aim: to eradicate us, to wipe us out. Think about how some of us have never been on our traditional territories, or only speak English, Dutch, Spanish, French. Think about how some of us have come to only identify with our religious denomination, Chaldean, Syriac, of Christianity, rather than as Ashuraye, as Assyrians. Even worse, we fought long and hard amongst each other about our name. And that division is not organic to us. That too has served a specific purpose, which is to divide and conquer us. And it is also part of colonization. So if there are no more Assyrians, they can't pose a threat to an Arab Iraq, a Turkish Turkey, whatever kind of homogenizing identity Iran has been undergoing in Iran, and then an Arab Syria, right? So the Assyrian identity has been very formative in shaping who I am. My earliest memory of my country of origin of Iraq is the sounds of war, as I'm sure many of you have. My earliest collective memory as an Assyrian is that of a land lost, a people scattered, a nation divided by artificial borders, but also of survival. of resistance and a refusal to be erased. So that's also part of the impact of genocide, right? We always remember the first part, which is trauma, and then we forget to remind ourselves that actually we have constantly refused to be erased. We're very stubborn like that. And that can only come from being persecuted, dislocated, dispossessed, and a struggle to survive these things. And I'll end there for now.
Yeah. Wow. Thank you.
Indeed.
I think it's an amazing way to put it, that we don't often think about, how it brings us together in a sense, and how we unite under that as well, because it's obviously horrifying, and it's a terrible thing that has happened to us, but we unify because we're stubborn, and that's where we have the power. We gotta overcome the splinters. So I think going back a little bit, Mariam, can you talk a little bit, more about those lasting impacts of genocide that are experienced by Assyrians today, in the traditional homeland as well as in diaspora?
I think there's incredibly serious impacts, right, that are experienced by Assyrians today in both locations, in the diaspora and the homeland. To be Assyrian is often to speak from a place of pain, an open wound, a collective wound of displacement, genocide, assimilation, regardless of where you are. So whether you're in the diaspora or in the homeland. For Assyrians in the homeland, I think, and I'm speaking as someone who is not now in the homeland, right? So there's also that disconnect there, and that has to be acknowledged. It means a constant survival mode, right? It doesn't let you focus on other things, and yet they still somehow do, like resurgence, right? So any and all these activities that revive the Assyrian identity and culture, which you'll hear about tomorrow, those are all resurgent practices that Assyrians do in the homeland to maintain who they are. But it also means a distrust, and rightfully so. We heard earlier about how the Peshmerga basically left Assyrians and others defenseless. A distrust of surrounding nations, right? They've been very terrible neighbors / colonizers. And that doesn't really let us, this distrust, and because it's ongoing, it doesn't let us move beyond this binary of native or indigenous settler colonizer, right? And so you don't see too many, at least in Iraq, which is the country I focus on, too many actual meaningful working together to kind of create a sovereign nation-to-nation relationship, especially in the north of Iraq. I will say that. So, but Assyrians in the diaspora, you're also in survival mode, right? So many of us were prepared for this pandemic. We weren't rushing out to buy toilet paper. Our parents have a whole makhzan of, I don't know about you, but just a lot of canned goods. Because we've had to survive, right? Of genocide, we've had to survive displacement, constant I was displaced many times before I ended up in Canada. We've had to survive migration. It's not easy to, at 10 years old, start interpreting things for your parents, right? So Assyrians in the diaspora are also dealing with PTSD from this trauma, which we've never processed. Anxiety, other mental health issues, which we don't often talk about. And we've never really been given the tools to name these experiences so that we can process them and move on with resurgent practices like reviving ourselves, right? This is what sorry, I just messed that up. It's so important because we have to first create these spaces for ourselves to process what has happened to us, what is still happening to us, right? Before we can move forward to get out of survival mode, to now thrive, to now revive ourselves, to be basically, to have this indigenous resurgence that we keep hearing other nations talk about. I'll stop there.
Thank you.
There's so many, all these
Lots
questions,
of
there's
good things
so
to
many
say.
things
So
to
much,
talk
yeah,
about, but
no, we could
I
be
also
here all
don't want
day.
to keep taking up so much space.
No, it's
so.
okay. We love to hear about it.
Good stuff.
I think touching a bit on what you said, Mariam, I would like to ask Jordan, how do you think, your family history personally and those stories of survival have shaped you are, and how have you come to terms with that, and how you understand your cultural identity?
Yeah, it's interesting that I probably think about it every day. Like I relate my own experience to the stories and the experiences of my ancestors, and again, it's like we're all going to face hardship and trials, and just my own dad, he's passed, and watching him go through a very long, dragged out, kind of miserable death with joy was just like a microcosm of what. It's just like, wow, there's such a beauty there, and it's what I always come back to is, man, how do we prepare ourselves to deal with the suffering with joy? And I think about it a lot. So I think about it every day, and that is mostly, very much informed by my Assyrian history and the stories I've been shared, and the people who were forged in those situations and what they've passed to me. But yeah, it's invaluable, but it puts into perspective. I mean, it helps me also dwell in this place of gratitude, right? Because we have so much, so it's hard for me to complain about anything, honestly, which is an advantage in life. So I honestly think about it every day, I think, and I'm thankful to it every day, to my grandma, grandpa, dad, all the people that went through that stuff. And I will say, I'm really, maybe I'll talk a little more later too, but I'm really grateful to all of you because so much of us in the diaspora are a little bit disconnected from Assyrian culture. And I've lived amongst indigenous people a lot in Siberia. And I see a dynamic very clearly that with those, they're more like you would envision Native Americans. It's like a nomadic culture, but it's also struggling to make it through. And not everybody chooses that way of life. Not everybody chooses to really relate to their Assyrian heritage, or in the case that I witnessed, to their Evenki heritage. But as long as some people do, and as long as some people hold the core, and everybody does a little bit, for those people like myself who are interested and who do want to honor that tradition, it's still there and available for us to dive into. So it's really important to maintain it and maybe not even have animosity for the people who don't, but just do your part to enrich and create and go forward and make that attractive to the others. But anyway, a few thoughts.
No, definitely. I think touching on what you were saying, the importance of exploring that and keeping it alive, play with the sharing of the stories of the genocide. And you mentioned earlier that it was sort of hard to get out of your family. Would you be able to talk about, how those stories were shared with you?
Yeah, fortunately, I had one aunt Georgette, and she was really into it all, and so she wrote it down and forced all her brothers and sisters to write their stories down. And so now I have a whole pamphlet that's just all that side of the family's memories and histories. Of course, like so many of us, it's too short. It only goes back to my grandpa, and beyond that, I don't know. And the lines cut in every direction, And so. But of my immediate family, I'm so thankful to it, and I'll tell my aunt all the time. I'd always ask her more detailed questions, how they went through World War II, how they went through all this stuff, and she was very open with it, and she was very active about getting that information from everybody in the family, which is now a big benefit to me, and it will be to my kids, and
Yeah, that's amazing. I think. And so you do intend to share them with your future generations?
We always do, and we already do, always telling the kids about it.
Wow, that is wonderful. I think taking a little bit of a step back, we've talked about the personal experiences with genocide and the effects on identity. Mariam, I did want to ask you, could you talk about, why genocide occurs and why indigenous groups are often targets? Why have we as Assyrians just been caught in this cycle of genocide for seemingly, a century?
That's a very good question. So every case of genocide does have its own context, its own political, social, historical context, and every case tells us something different. And this is what my research is on, there's something that we can generalize about this experience, which is that there has not been one modern nation state that has been made in the modern world without first removing its indigenous inhabitants. Think about that. So I know a lot of us think a lot about our religion, and that comes into play obviously in different contexts, and that's important to think about. But when you step outside of us, right, when you look at the global making of the modern nation state, each one has involved the removal of indigenous inhabitants in a very targeted, systemic, structural way. And that's because nationalism and the making of a state are intertwined. You make a state by making a nation. All of us are one, and everyone on the outside is a threat to that. I'm obviously trying to simplify something that is very complex, right? And so this is how modern nationalism functions. It's organized racism, basically. So you can't make an Iraq, especially an Arab Iraq, without removing Assyrians. They'll always be there to say, hey, we're not Arab. So there'll always be that threat to your nationalism. So they have to go. And this is not a game of like ideologies or nations. This is about land. So you always have to remember this. It doesn't matter what tools or instruments or something gets politicized like religion, like identity or whatever. It's always about land. Land is life. Land is resources. Land is where our identity comes from. All of the Assyrian identity is forged in relation to that specific land. Right? And so you have to be able, if you want to create an Iraq or a Syria or a Turkey or an Iran, you have to take that land and you have to make it, whatever instrument you're using, nationalism, identity, whatever, you have to take that over because it's also worth money. It's worth billions of dollars, this land, because of oil. Or in the case of here, in oil or minerals or resources, whatever it is, right? And so I don't want us to think about genocide as something that's in the past. Genocidal practices, colonialism, our colonization is ongoing. Right now, the Kurdistan region of Iraq, or what they're calling it as that, is, in fact, just occupied Assyria. That's what it is. So this is the ongoing colonization of my village, of Enish in the north, of many other villages, right? It keeps going until these states are forged. And even when they are forged, the first thing Iraq did when it became a state and was liberated from the British mandate was what? Simil, right? To forge their Arab identity, they killed off Assyrians who refused to be called anything else, right? And so we have to think about this as ongoing land theft, and that's what our goal shouldn't be to say, well, I'm going to keep calling this now the Kurdistan region of Iraq. I'm going to refuse this title, and if I have to use it to be coherent or legible, I'm going to say what is today known as the Kurdistan region of Iraq, right? Because it is Beth Nahran, and it will always be Beth Nahran if we see it as that, if we call it that. The naming of spaces is very important. And a part of decolonization has to be land repatriation, and it has to mean us using our names for those lands, not refusing to call them by any other name, right? And I think that's really important to keep in mind about genocide. It's not that we are Christian. We're not being removed because we are Christians. Saddam didn't care whether we were Christians, as long as we called ourselves Arabs. We're being removed for being Assyrian, even if religion comes into play. And if you connect that experience, ongoing experience, to other indigenous groups across the globe, you will see that your story is not unique. You have a shared experience with other indigenous groups all around the world who are still experiencing ongoing genocides and ongoing colonization of the land we're today meeting on, and all of us are from in the diaspora, and we have to make those connections in order to move forward, in order to revive ourselves, I think. I'll stop there.
Wow. I have very little to add because that was so very powerful. But I think it raises a good question. You know, we're sitting here trying to talk about the effects of genocide on our identity, but you have a very profound point that the genocide hasn't stopped. We're in survival mode, and how can we try to assess the effects on our identity when we're not even past it? It's ongoing, and it's something that I think is important for us to think about and discuss, and I'm glad we are today. I just do have a few more questions to get through, and hear more from you, Mariam, and your story, Jordan, as well. So I want to go back to Jordan, your experience. You spent time in Siberia. You mentioned your experiences with the Indigenous Venki people, and how it was important to you, and that you felt that connection with that land. And I think it's profound that your journey led you there, knowing that tens of thousands of Assyrians were exiled to Siberia and tragically died there of starvation and disease. So your story, in some sense, returning there as the descendant of survivors, could be seen as one of triumph of some sort. So I guess, how do you process that connection? And would you say, I think you've alluded to it a little bit, but that your family stories did influence you when you competed on Alone?
Yeah, it was interesting going to Siberia, and it was actually interesting finding there's a pretty robust Assyrian community in parts of Russia, but going to Siberia, maybe I'll touch on a similar theme again. Maybe it's beating a dead horse, but it's a place of, you think of like gulags and death camps and this and that, but honestly, over time, I grew to see it as like a place of like beauty and of something I really appreciated. I could really see the beauty in that place. And I feel like when you go through something like a genocide, when you go through such trial, in order to not get lost until, wiped away, is you have to keep seeing beauty, keep creating, keep moving forward. It's very similar in. It's funny because one of the neat things about the wilderness is the lessons you learn are applicable on any level. So wilderness life is very simple, and the solutions are very simple, but you can extrapolate it all the way up the ladder to global issues almost. But you run into a problem. You have something that's in front of you. A Wolverine's attacking. You have some kind of an issue. It's up to you to not focus on, wow, this is an issue, this is terrible. What's going to happen. When it's just you in the woods, the only thing you can do is stand up, figure out a solution, and try it. And maybe it doesn't work. And then all you can do is try another solution, and just constantly create and innovate. And I think even in maintaining our culture, as much as we want to hang on to the past, we also have to create and innovate and realize that it's also dynamic and I don't know how long I have, but those are kind of the thoughts that I have that correlate. The Assyrian culture is amazing, and the more that we can lean into the beauty of it, the more that we can make it attractive to each other and to, the more we can enrich each other and make a community, the more that's going to be a proactive solution for the future, and anyway.
We maintain the resilience.
Yeah.
We stay resilient, and then
there are times where you're like huddled up defense mode, but it's important to also come out of that in attack mode.
Yeah, no, definitely. Killing a Wolverine. That's what he did that. So look up the videos. I think it's a beautiful sentiment that we have to be resilient. We have to ensure, as Mariam said, that they aren't successful, that those that are against us are not successful, and we maintain that through our culture and through perseverance.
Right.
I think I'll finish off here with Mariam. You've said some really powerful things today, and I've loved hearing every minute of it. I'm not the best Oprah because I'm also engaged. I'm like, oh my gosh, that's a great point.
No,
so
you're a
it's
great
fun.
Oprah.
Thank you. But before we go into Q&A and giving you all a response, I did want to hear just a little bit more about, seeing how genocide has driven so many of us into diaspora, away from our ancestral lands, as you mentioned. What does this mean for our identity as an Indigenous group? How can one identify as Indigenous in the diaspora in these other places that we all exist in?
So one thing we have to acknowledge is there is a very real threat to our existence in our ancestral homeland because our numbers we saw earlier keep dwindling. So that is a very real threat. And indigeneity is land-based, it's place-based. So it does matter that we are leaving our ancestral homeland. And I'm not judging people who leave, obviously, right? They're trying to survive, but I'm just saying that if we all leave, then that does pose a very real threat to our existence. But I also really want to drive home the fact that indigeneity is a relational identity. What does that mean? It means that I only become Indigenous when I am being colonized and the colonizer is imposing their identity over me and trying to turn me into what they are. And by doing that, they marginalize my identity, or they try to erase my identity, or assimilate me. That's when I become Indigenous. It's a very specific process, right? That's what this process by Arabs, Turks, Kurds, this process is what transforms Assyrians into Indigenous peoples, because we are experiencing this ongoing colonization. Otherwise, we'd just be Ashuraye in Beth Nahran. We wouldn't be here. We wouldn't need this political category of Indigenous, right? So it's a binary relationship. It's in opposition. By its very nature, it is in opposition to this colonizing identity. It is struggling against this identity, and it is refusing this identity, right? That takes agency, right? Yes, we are undergoing a process of trauma and all this stuff, but when you said joy, I'm actually not surprised, because joy is a revolutionary act that Indigenous peoples every day, I call myself Assyrian, that's revolutionary, right? That's me saying I'm refusing to be called Kurd, even though there are very real structural reasons for me to call myself that, right? They're working really hard at getting us to be Kurdish, just like Iraq works really hard at getting us to be Arab, right? So even in the diaspora, we are Indigenous because we are resisting this colonization. This guy was from Australia, and he made a whole film about our experience, and he took it around the world to show people. He was being his Assyrian self, and that informed how he did what he does, which is make films, right? Assyrians do this every day. That's what Michael was talking about, our human capital, right? I could have studied anything else in political science. It's a very vast field, right? But I chose to think about Assyrians, right? Even in the diaspora, the land remembers us. She doesn't forget us. When we go home, and that's why these Gishru trips are so phenomenal, because they allow you to go home to even have that connection, even though you live in the diaspora and are not going to move home permanently. But that give and take, that relationship you have to the land, that's maintained because the land remembers us. I'll stop there.
Yeah. It's beautiful. Thank you both again for sharing, your personal and your amazing stories and viewpoints as well. I think it's a hard topic. As I mentioned, it's not fun to talk about. It's not something that people really want to talk about all the time, but it's vital. And I think, as Mariam mentioned, we're a resilient people. We need to be resilient to push against this, and sharing our stories and talking about things like the impacts of genocide and our family stories are key to doing that. It informs how you live your everyday life, and understanding those stories helps us know how powerful our ancestors were and how resilient they were, and the things that happened to them are so important for us to keep their memory alive and to avoid any future genocides or the current genocides that are happening to us, and to continue to be resilient. So I think we have some time for questions for Jordan and Mariam, if anyone would like to ask. We have a runner coming with the microphone.
All right, so this question is for Jordan himself. So I don't know if anyone else has seen the Alone series. I binged it. This guy had like icicles in his beard, eating rabbits, like protecting his food and stuff. So I was just curious, how do you think being Assyrian impacted your ability to perform on the show, to fight adversity, and just to overcome the challenges you had on the show?
Yeah, I mean, a good question. I touched on a little bit earlier, but just it's so important to have perspective. It's amazing to see, I was curious when I got out. I was like, wow, it ended at 77 days. Like, what happened to everybody else? And I was curious to go watch the show and see, and then you see like, oh man, it's easy to lose perspective when you're going through a struggle of some sort. And being Assyrian and kind of being, bathed in those stories from a young age, I kind of just always had a perspective on whatever I was going through. And it just allowed me to endure it, really focusing so much more on what I had than what I didn't have. So much gratitude for every rabbit that I was able to catch, or every positive thing, as opposed to really focusing on what was. There were also very, getting my fat stolen, or getting this, that, or there's a lot of things you can go either way. But when you're like, man, compared to what Dad, Grandma, Grandpa went through, it's just nothing to complain about. And I just, and it is those lessons again, and then they're very tangible to me. But the lessons of enduring suffering with a joy, and like leaning into the joy that's kind of deep in us is really important. And I think that's fed by having the gratitude, and all that just is played into our Assyrian identity if we choose to lean on those aspects of it. But it played a big role.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. Mariam, I would like to personally thank you for all you do. You are so eloquent in how you articulate some of the most important things academically. I would like to remind you and inform everyone when I had invited you as a speaker to CSU Stanislaus and Turlock for the Assyrian Genocide Remembrance Day. And again, your comments were so powerful and profound. And I want to tell you, when we invite non-Assyrians to these events, when we invite members of the Sikh community who have suffered and are suffering a genocide, the Hmong community, the Asians, we had invited veterans who heard your comments for the first time, who said, Carmen, we have defended your churches in your ancestral homeland. And my second comment has to do with, I'm so appreciative to you for mentioning mental health. That brief movie that we saw, I know there were so many things in that scene, but my heart is with the little girl in the closet. Because I work with refugees who come to our region that are being resettled. And we want them to know we have an obligation. I have a personal obligation, and I know many of us in this room do. And we all have different talents of how we can help the continuity of the survival of our refugees, whether they're immigrants, whether they're refugees, asylum seekers, whether they're young, as that little girl in the closet, or they are parents of our parents. Remember, you said we're the ones who answer the phone, read the letters? But also, how do we find that? How do we fight the stigma? How do we reduce and eliminate the stigma that has to do with this intergenerational trauma of what our nation goes through? And when someone like you or that panel, all of you, everyone who's spoken in this wonderful conference, please keep talking about it. Let's find a way to improve the quality of life of those Assyrians who are settled, not just in America, but everywhere where they find peace and refuge. Thank you.
If you have a question?
Yeah, a few hands over there.
I'll be back on this one. Okay. If we can try and keep them brief, please, just because we've only got a few minutes left.
Hello, my name's Sarah. It's less of a question, more of a comment. Mariam, you said the land remembers us. So I just went on the Geishu trip, and one of my biggest takeaways was how much I felt connected to the land, which was truly an out-of-body experience for me. And my mom's family's from Armenia. Growing up, I was like, okay, it's this faraway place. It's in Iran now, blah, blah, blah. So I never associated with being from Iraq. But when I was there, I was like, oh, this is my homeland. I am from here. I felt that. I really can't put words to it, and I think about it every day. It's really magical. So I appreciate you saying that.
That's amazing.
Hi. Oh. Okay. So I have a question. I mean, both of you could answer it, but it's more directed at Mariam because I'm forgetting the source, and I hate when that happens. But I read it somewhere where it was this expectation that America will decolonize Iraq for Assyrians is set on an erroneous premise because that would, a colonizer nation can't decolonize a nation because then that would set a precedent for the delegitimization of America's place as our own claim to the land of America. Our as in Americans here, not Assyrians. But I was thinking about that, and I can't think of an example of a decolonized nation. So when you, do you think the Assyrian struggle for, land rights can exist in a microcosm where it has to be a greater structure of decolonization? Because if there's no example of it, are we existing in I mean, I guess I'm phrasing this wrong. It's more does it have to be a part of a greater struggle of decolonization? Because how can it exist isolated when there's no precedent?
Okay. Should I answer or should I wait for?
No.
Oh, okay.
Answer.
Thank you for that question. So there's two pieces of what I'm hearing you say. So decolonization is something that is globally necessary, and the reason why decolonization struggles or movements come together is because they are stronger together. They can learn from each other and each other's struggles, and they can stand in solidarity with each other, right? And move beyond this state in order to decolonize. The state is not actually going to decolonize itself by itself. That's not a thing in my opinion. So that's one. But there are examples of decolonization, right? So you have an entire continent who underwent decolonization, like when there was formal colonization of Africa, they decolonized, right? To not be under colonial rule anymore. So that's one. So there's different definitions of what we're talking about here. But I'll give you an example of a modern day. So right now there's a nation, I forget which one, there's a nation that just won a land claim of land back in Canada, right? That's decolonization, right? So decolonization is local. You can do these things when you fight for them. We have so much to learn from other indigenous groups around the world, but especially where we live. We all live in places where we can learn from indigenous nations there about their struggles, because that will tell us something about our own struggles, but it will also tell us about how we can come together and decolonize. But that does happen. There are examples. It's just not always widespread. So we really have to do that work of looking for it and then actually finding these people and making those connections and relations.
I found the discussion so far very enlightening, and something that had jogged my memory when we were talking about the land. I've had several discussions with other friends and colleagues about this, fellow Assyrians, and we find that it's important that we concentrate on making Atra a place where people are comfortable living in, because if our numbers continue to dwindle, no one takes us seriously over there. We have no power, no land. And what are your thoughts on what can be done to make it a place that people would not leave, number one? And two, do you find that an emphasis on buying and protecting land from people in diaspora to help the Nineveh Plains or other villages expand so that we can have a place back home, not only to visit, but to protect and call ours?
So there are people far better situated to answer this question than me in this very room, like Dr. Michael Uesh, like Savina over there, who actually lived in Atra until a few years ago. I will say that the struggle for land is very key. And we really have to do everything in our power here to support land struggles back there. The fact that we're thinking about buying our own land back that was stolen from us, that to me sounds like a very broken system and not always sustainable. But I do think that we really need to support the endeavors, whether they be helping those back home buy back their land that was stolen, or in other ways, because they back home are struggling to get back land that was stolen or to maintain their land. So the most important thing we can do is actually listen to them and what they're saying they want done, and then supporting that. But like Michael said, find people who are actually working not under the auspices of the KRI or the KDP or the Badr or whoever else, people who are actually working for Assyrians in the Assyrian name. That's very important, right? Not getting caught up in all of these political games that happen, but actually finding Assyrians who are working for Assyrians. And that's why talking to someone like Savina would be really enlightening, because she would tell you people on the ground, or someone like Michael.
Mm-hmm.
Hello. So my comments are to Dr. Mariam. I agree with a lot of what you said, and I think it's really important to really listen to what you spoke. And but just to add on that, I had a question in mind. I mean, to myself and to everybody, and maybe it's a question / comment. We have to. I noticed, since yesterday and today, and just in general, as being Assyrian, in our Assyrian community, mainly and mostly, we tend to not mention the name of our land. So a lot of us, we call it Atra, Atrat Awahate, homeland, our motherland, but we always, almost, most of the time, fail to mention the name, which is Assyria, because we are called Assyrians because of the land. Yes, the land is important, is very important, and I mentioned that, when we were speaking about the, what to define, how to define your identity, and it is from the land. It comes from the land. Our land was called Mat Ashur in ancient Assyria, which means the land of Ashur, the land of Assyria, or Assyria. So we have to be very specific and not be shy to mention that name, because we are Assyrians. We come from Assyria. It's not Iraq. It's not Syria. It's not Iran or Lebanon or any other country. We have to know that Assyria, we are indigenous to Assyria and only Assyria. Just so we don't get confused. I mean, I hope everybody does their due diligence in studying their history, just to know that any other country outside of the borders of Assyria, which is the Assyrian Triangle today, is considered diaspora for us. Even Iraq, even Syria, even Lebanon, even any other country in the Middle East. Assyria, we are only indigenous to Assyria. Thank you.
I'll do you one better. So when we say Assyria, that's in English. When I write, I call it Bithnahran, because that's what it's called in our language. Ashur, right? So when we're talking, I think it's really important to use our own language to call our places by that name. And even in an English context, you could still say Ashur, you could still say Bithnahran, you could still use those words and then just say what they mean, instead of Mesopotamia or the land between two rivers or Iraq or whatever. And if you do have to use Iraq or Turkey, so-called Iraq, what's today called as Iraq, if you notice me saying, right? Because it is known as that today, but that doesn't make it legitimate.
Thanks. We can take one more, but a question, please. No comments.
Thank you to both of you for your testimonies today. It's been super interesting. My question is to one of you or either of you, whoever wants to answer it, but I think a lot of us struggle with this sort of dual identity of some of us that were born here in America, that we are also Assyrian, but we're also sort of, and this came up earlier, Assyrian American. So I guess to both of you, how do you balance sort of having sort of these two identities, or do you not? Do you prefer to have, I just want to know your thoughts on that. Like, do you prefer to kind of make Assyrian most of your identity, or like what exactly goes into that?
Yeah, it's a good question. We all try to struggle with it, right? Have that mixed identity. But I lean side with an asterisk. But to say what I was saying earlier, there's I see the Assyrian community, especially in the diaspora, like defined in a certain way. Like we've talked about a little bit with a few of that I've talked with, but everybody lives in Chicago or LA or what. But I know my grandfather came from a rural area in Iraq, and so it's like I kind of appreciate the opportunity to show Assyrians who identify as Assyrians living in a slightly different way than is typical for the diaspora. So we can you're still an Assyrian if you have your animals and live on land, which is probably what many of them do back in the place. So so that's an important part, but it goes just to what I was speaking with earlier, that we also have to create a little bit and create and add to our community that is fellow Assyrians and be a part of that project of developing.
Can I add something to this? Mm-hmm. I think that's a really good question, especially for those of us who might have spent more of our lives here than on our homeland or born here. I would invite you not to be afraid of fragmentation. Mm-hmm. Our identities are fragmented, right? I couldn't give you a talk in my specialization, like a formal talk in Assyrian, but I could definitely have a conversation with you in Assyrian, right? My identity is fragmented along 3 languages, right? I'm not perfect at English, I'm not perfect at Arabic, I'm not perfect at Assyrian, but I speak all 3 of them, and all 3 of them shape my worldview, mostly Assyrian because it was my mother tongue. But You see what I'm saying? Like, all of our identities are fragmented, and that's okay. That just means you are surviving colonization. But our identities are also have other intersectionalities, which I would also invite you to think about, right? So our ethnicity as Assyrian is one thing, but then I'm also a woman. I'm also racialized in my new location of being in Canada, right? For the first time in my life, I was brown. Before that, I was Assyrian, right? So their identities are always shifting, and fragmentation happens, and that's okay. You are still who you are, right? And you can bring all of those together. You can be Assyrian if you're born here. You can be Assyrian if you grew up here, even if you don't speak Assyrian perfectly. You can learn that when you're old. I just talked to someone who said they learned Assyrian at 18 years old. That's incredible, right? So fragmentation is also part of survival.
And really quickly, we just have one more question. Sorry, I lied. It's a good one. So,
Jordan, you had an experience with indigenous peoples in Siberia.
Yeah.
And Mariam, and obviously we're all indigenous. And Mariam, you have an expertise and also experience working with indigeneity across the globe as an issue. Can each of you comment on your sense of what allyship and solidarity is with others, and then how you see it reciprocating back to Assyrians?
Well, that's good. It is a very good question. Of course, I spent a lot of time living with, right, an indigenous group, these Evenki people, and it's a really cool culture. I really appreciated it, and it has its own issues. You know, they have their own issues that are really struggling, and it feels like 1880s in America, where with the Native Americans, we just think, is it going to survive or not, their way of life? And I really hope it does. And I would try to, be an ally to them in the best way that I could. And that was mostly trying to, it goes to your question earlier, how do you make the homeland attractive, right? And I thought the same thing, like, boy, they're kind of in an uncanny valley where in Russia, nobody appreciates their culture, but they have to, but if they can just get over this little hump, I'm sure that people are going to see how beautiful their culture is and for what it is. And so I would just try to maybe encourage them to, if they could develop economically slightly to where they could sell their hides or invite people to join in on their culture and tour around. And, so I would try to facilitate those things and think, because one thing I did see, and one thing I appreciate for all of you who are bringing forward Assyrian culture, is that those that are disconnected from it in Russia, from the Evenki culture, lived lives that were they never integrated well into the Russian society, but then they didn't have their Evenki culture, and so it kind of left them a little bit lost. But around those villages where there was a reindeer herding traditional culture still for them to relate to, everybody thrived. Even the people that weren't reindeer herders, because they had that to tap into. They could take pride in the fact that, these people are doing that. They could go, we might go visit the homeland or something. They could go and spend a summer with the herders out there. And so all that to say, it's hard on the nitty gritty. It is hard to know how to be a good ally sometimes, and you have to try to not cause more harm than good, and do all the thoughtfully be an ally. But it's really appreciated. I know they've told me that. Even in my clumsy, I was just some guy over there. But I just do my best to try to be a part and a loving relationship with these people I really care for. That's all you can do in an allyship, and try to express love for others, So if you actually have a heart for, we're speaking and allying, I guess, with other people, then that a genuine care for those people, which is facilitated by relationships and stuff. Yeah. But then how can others be great allies to us?
I did have a quick follow-up, though. Did you share your stories with them?
Yeah. Tell them about. Yeah. I was like, hey, we're Indigenous too, because
we're talking a lot about the importance of sharing our oral history with our own people, and you can share that with them as well.
They like to hear that too. It's like they like to.
Yeah.
Yep.
I think this is such an important question. Thank you for asking it. I know we're running out of time, so I'm going to try to be really brief. in all of my work, I've come across and heard the stories of many indigenous people, and they're all from in different indigenous nations. And they all have their own particularities and their own ideologies and their own whatever. But one thing we have in common is this experience of colonization and all that it has entailed. And I mean, colonization is not a thing by itself that is underpinned by many other structures like racism, like class, right? Like, these are not separate things. So I really want to echo what you were saying, because allyship and solidarity is about making connections and building real, meaningful relations that have to be guided by a genuine care and love, right? So not thinking about what you can do for me, but thinking about looking around and seeing everyone who has something in common with you, right? And thinking, how can we make these connections in order to overthrow these structures that are oppressing us? We don't have to agree on everything, but we need to agree that there is class oppression. Racial capitalism is a thing. We need to agree on that. It's destroying our planet, and it's just destroying our indigenous way of life. And we are being colonized to steal resources and land, right? We have to agree that the indigenous experience includes our racialization into this other, whether it's black, brown, whatever, right? We're being racialized as indigenous peoples, and we have something in common with other indigenous peoples and other racialized peoples. We don't need to be the same as them, but we have a common experience. And when we come together and build those links, instead of being very separate, then we can overthrow these structures. Because at the end of the day, the only way we will actually decolonize and liberate ourselves is by dismantling and overthrowing these structures. So I'll stop here.
Powerful. Awesome. Thank you all for the thoughtful questions, and thank you again to our panelists. They'll be here, so if anyone has further questions, obviously I'm throwing you guys under the bus, but feel free to go up to them and ask them.
And then just to add, like, yeah, feel free to reach out to me. I mean, since I have an Instagram that I would be really happy to hear from any of you on about anything. So if you want to go on an adventure in the wilderness.
Yes, please.
Really
and I think we'll be sharing videos from Alone. We'll send out some links so you can watch our famous panelists in the wilderness, which will be awesome. And Mariam, anything you have to share as well, please send it our way. We'll share it with
I do
everyone.
have a Twitter and a Facebook and an Instagram,
Yeah.
but I don't go on Twitter often, but I am on there.
Yeah.
But I just want to say thank you so much for
Yeah.
having me here and for being such an engaging audience. It was absolutely
Amazing.
my pleasure and honor to be with you today.
Huge honor. Yep,
Thank you guys.